Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Sorry if I sound a bit different in some. A few of them were from when I wasn't well, but most of them should sound pretty good. I hope you're doing great and have a really good day. I love you and take care. And make sure you check out my Instagram at Joe the Insomniac and the podcast in the description below. This happened when I was probably 7 or 8. When I was a kid, I lived in a pretty sketchy neighbourhood. We lived in those long apartments. Ones are attached to the sides rather than stacked on top of each other. The front of the apartment faced a main road, and there's a little street to access the park and woods and back area of the apartment. Behind the apartments is a massive field and a forest. Me and my friends and I used to go there to build hobbit holes in the grass. My mum hated it when we went out there because there were some rough people that lived in the neighbourhood. She didn't like the idea of 7-year-olds playing out there in the same place where people do drugs. I'm adding some more details so you can get a picture. Now one day, I was out in the woods by myself, just exploring and pretending to be Indiana Jones or something, and I was coming out of the tall grass. I could see the little back alley in between the parking area and the woods, and I saw something lying in the grass. I believe it's a deer. I think it's just sleeping, so I creep up on it, trying to not scare it. I know, cool. That was quite funny. When I got there, I knew something was off. The deer was too still and smelled horrible. I couldn't see its face, and its back was facing me, but when I got up to it, I nearly had a heart attack when I saw its entire stomach is ripped open. I wasn't a smart kid, but I knew this was messed up. When I turned to run back home to tell my mum, I saw another deer nailed to a tree next to the first. I don't know how I didn't notice this before, but its 2 front hooves are literally nailed to it. It's a disgusting scene, as you can imagine. As I stood there, staring at it, a car drove past a little alley. I remember it's a white car with tinted windows driving really slowly. I mean, everyone drove slowly on this alley because it's a residential street, but these people were barely moving. I can't see inside, but I got the sinking feeling that they were watching me. Obviously, I can't be sure that they are, but I'm 99% sure it was them. Once they were gone, I booked it home and told my mum the whole thing. She told me not to go in the field again, and I agree. I really hated what I saw. For the next month or so, I saw that car drive everywhere. It would drive up and down the main road I was on while I was playing in the front yard. It would drive down and back towards the alley when I would be back in the yard. I even remembered seeing it at a grocery store once, but they were definitely staking the house out. It was always the white car, tinted windows, maybe they're following me, and always driving way too slowly to be normal. I tell my mum about it, but she chalks it up to a neighbour just going down the road. So one day, my mum was out mowing the lawn. Because of the way the apartment is, she had to push the lawnmower all the way around the apartments to get to our backyard. Being the helpful kid I was going to meet my mum out the back to open the gate so she can put the lawnmower in the shed. As I'm walking out the gate, I see the car come along the back alley. Normally, the car goes slow. As soon as it turns a corner, however, the driver steps on the gas, zooming up behind me. The back door closest to me opens and someone gets out and starts running towards me. I don't remember what he looked like or even if it was a he. I just remembered getting back home as quick as I can, terrified. After that, my dad yelled at me for peeing myself, and neither he nor my mum believed me about the guy in the car, and I never saw him again, and we moved a few months later. That sounds really harsh, Jesus. My parents still think I made up the whole thing. even though they thought how sketchy the neighborhood was. I don't remember anyone going missing at that time in my town, but I never really looked it up. All I know is it was really messed up, and I have no idea who those people were and why they did that to the deer or what they planned for me. I just hope they never done anything to anyone else. This happened a few years ago, and we didn't know exactly who this man was, but it still scared me senselessly. When I was about 13, I used to have my bed right under my bedroom window. It was also around the time my dog was brought inside because she got too old to stay out. At the time, we didn't have screens covering the doors like we do now, or the windows, so the windows could easily be opened and there's no barrier. I always left my window open during the day to let in fresh air, then close and lock it when it starts getting dark. The house is surrounded by forest, not very thick, but still thick enough that you can't clearly see through it. It's completely normal to hear strange noises at night, because things like bears or stray dogs or even former neighbours' chickens would roam around through our backyard. So when I heard something shuffling around my window, I didn't think much of it, and continued playing video games. Not even 10 minutes later, I heard something hit against it. It may have just been a large June bug. When they hit a window, it sounds like rocks being thrown, so I literally ignore it. The knocking kept going, but I just kept ignoring it until finally it stopped. Fast forward until around 2 AM. I was finally settling down and going to sleep when I hear breathing. Very faint, enough to miss if my room wasn't silent. I heard something drag down my window, like a stick or finger. I did it a few times, and that was enough for me. I jump out of bed, running to my dad's room. I told him that there was something at my window, and he immediately came to look. We turned on the lights, and nothing's there. I told him what I heard, and he said he's gonna look in the morning. We did just that, and my stomach churned. Under my window, there were two completely different foot tracks, one back and forth besides the generator, looking directly under my window. There's even cigarette butts laying on the floor, and ashes. Like they've been there for a while. The foot tracks led towards the woods, and seemed to stop there. We have no idea who this was, and to this day even thinking of this terrifies me. Afterward we put locks on the windows and screens up, but I'll never forget that day. Okay, so this was a normal rainy evening when I was 14. I played games until my mum come in and told me to go to sleep. But before I get to the creepy parts, I'll give you an overview of our home. Our house is located on a hill. The closest neighbours are literally 100 meters further at the road. This road leads to nowhere, so there are rarely people going past our home. Behind the house is a little forest area that I used to play in as a child. And also, the house has 2 floors. My room is at the second upper floor. Yeah, I gotta admit it's a lonely house, with rain, darkness, and a forest that could keep me a little bit worried if I didn't know what was in there. So I went to sleep as usual at 11 PM. I fell asleep very quickly. However, at 3 AM I woke up, and I didn't do that so often. I think I had to go to the bathroom or something, so I went to pee and look through the window and do my thing. But it wasn't that relaxing nightly forest that I saw. My eyes glued on a specific character in the darkness. A man wearing dark clothes was just standing at the path of the forest. I don't know what he was doing. I started to panic, of course, and switched off the bathroom lights really quick. I sneak up to my parents downstairs, and I've never felt so afraid moving in my home in my life. We had alarms on, but it didn't calm me. I took a look at my parents. They're asleep. My sister's not up either. I went to the kitchen and peeked through the window. There he was, still standing at the pathway, closer now. And now I can see his body. I can't figure out his face. He looks huge. I just sat at the window, scared and almost falling to tears. Little rain poured to the ceiling and made naturally chill sounds. That didn't help. I peeked through the window again, and I almost jump out of my skin when he's standing in the yard now. I can see his face. He looks terrifying. I now ran to my parents to wake them up. My father ran out the back door, but my mum said that he could be dangerous and might be armed. She calls the police. Movement inside the house made the guy move, and he runs towards the road and the forest. My father swore that he couldn't go after him, but was mad that he couldn't. Now we wait for the cops to show up. Eventually they show up and ask questions and check out the forest with my dad. At this point, I went to sleep again with my mum, terrified but managed to sleep. I still have nightmares about this today. When I was young, me and my brother loved to go and play and explore in the forest near where we lived. We had a group of neighbourhood friends that we'd also do this with, and to be honest, those were some of my best memories. However, this would all change one day, and everything seems like normal. We set off on a normal summer's evening, and we decide we're going to play hide and seek. Now, to get to where we play, we have to walk through a bit of a swampland. I say swamp, it's not really a swamp, but it feels very similar to one. So we're walking through this, stumbling around, and finally make it to the giant tree. This is the exact tree that marks the spot where we play. So, I have to look for people unfortunately, but it's my turn, so that's fine. I hide behind this tree and start counting. I finally get to 1 and say I'm ready for you lot. And I burst out laughing when I see one of my stupid friends has literally climbed on top of the tree, hit directly above me, got caught instantly, then starts panicking that he can't get down. I help him down and I say, "You search the left side, I'm gonna go a bit deeper and find these." He says fine. To be honest, more than anything, I can't wait to tell the others how stupid he was. As I'm walking, I see something up ahead. It's a dark figure. I laugh and start sprinting up there. I stumble on the way and hurt my knee though, so I was quite annoyed about this. But by the time I get there, the figure's moved. Now I'm looking around and something feels very odd. It feels like I'm being watched, but not like in hide and seek. This is almost like a much darker, ominous presence is there. I've literally never had a feeling like it since then. So I look around when I see part of a hand. Well, it's not a hand, it's a stick that looks like a hand, but I can make out what it is in the shadows. As I get closer, I see it's holding something. I think that's really odd. I get a bit closer and realise that it's a skeleton hand. One that looks slightly degraded, like it's been there for some time. Halloween's around the corner, so I'm sure it's a Halloween prop. I hold up the piece of paper and look inside. It says run. It's not in any of my friend's handwriting. And then, to my horror, I see a shadow appear behind me. I glance back for a second, and there's 2 giants of men standing there in full camo gear, with smirks on their faces. I drop the paper and let out this blood-curdling scream, and I begin to sprint my way back. I end up going all the way to the tree, and to my horror, I'm met by all of my friends there, who can see how scared I am, and we all sprint all the way back home. When I get there, I explain what's happened, and my brother's so scared he starts crying, where he's younger than me. We're more scared of getting in trouble with our parents, don't even bother telling them, but looking back on it now, I really wish I'd done something more at the time, like told the authorities or something. I hate the thought that there's some twisted, mental people out there that would do something like this. God knows what their intentions were, but I can guarantee you that they weren't good. A little backstory first. I grew up in upstate New York, about 30 minutes north of Syracuse to be exact. It only made sense that I would return to my quiet little part of the world after I got out of the Marines in 2007. The only problem is that I didn't have much money. The good news is that my grandfather had an old pool behind camper that he told me I could have until I got on my own feet. So, being on my own, I decided I'd spend about a year in the pool, behind on a few acres of woods that I bought from a friend of mine while I was in the Marines. Now all my taxes had been paid for the year, so the only thing I had to do was pay for gas and propane. I managed to avoid looking like a crazy mountain man by showering and washing my clothes at a local truck stop / diner, even getting a pretty decent job working security. I filled the rest of my time working odd jobs for extra cash. Alright, so for the main story. It was mid-April. I was sitting next to a nice low fire while listening to my battery-powered radio, watching nightfall in the woods. I had gotten a nice dinner at the diner down the road, so I didn't have any work for the next few days. Generally, I don't see anyone in the woods for weeks at a time, so I wasn't expecting it when I hear a scream to break the silence. I shot up, grab my shotgun, and get out of the camper and check the chamber to make sure it's loaded. I stood on the edge of a small clearing, strained my ears to listen for any sounds. It's generally hard to pinpoint sounds in the dead of night in the woods, but luckily I hear some shouting and car doors slamming, so I knew that the sounds had to be coming from the main vehicle trail a short distance from my campsite. I made my way to the trail as fast as I could in the low light, and before I get halfway there, I heard another clipped scream to my left. I could hear a rustling in the brush. I slowly made my way there, and to where I think the noise is coming from, I come out of the woods right next to a man who had a woman pinned to the ground, just standing over her. Shaking from adrenaline, I leveled the shotgun at the top of the guy, and the woman growled at him to get off. Now I'm a big guy, but I have no doubt that the shotgun was the deciding factor in this whole situation. Each of these guys easily had a solid 30 pounds of muscle on me when I was a 200-pound Marine. I ushered the two idiots back, so I was between them. The woman's now getting to her feet. It was about now I realised we have another problem. My cell phone was cheap and didn't get reception in the woods, and hers had been broken by these two sickos. There wasn't much I could do other than march these two back to their jeep under the threat of shotgun. I get the license number, and I'm sure it was fake, and a description of them and their vehicle. Before the driver gets in the vehicle, I lower the shotgun to his crotch and made sure he understood what a 3-inch 12-gauge shell loaded would do. They took off in one direction. Me and the woman made our way back to my campsite. We drove to the DEC station and reported it as quick as possible. It turns out that the guy I'd threatened was the young girl's now ex-boyfriend. They'd been out having a few drinks when the third wheel in the situation got a little too handsy for her liking. When she said something to her boyfriend, he basically told her to stop and get on with it for once. When she refused, the boyfriend smashed her phone and pushed her to the ground. They both pushed her into the truck and drove her deep into the woods. She had waited for them to become complacent before throwing the back door open and jumping out and taking off. Luckily, the Jeep was crap and the back door didn't lock. It was a stroke of luck that I happened to be outside when she escaped. Fast forward 7 months and that woman I helped is now my wife, and we moved into our first house using the money I saved up living in the woods. We've been married for 8 years now, and I have 2 kids, a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. I still go out to camp every year to hunt and haven't seen the Jeep or the guys again. We heard through the grapevine that they had been arrested and actually got jail time. I'm assuming they moved to a different area because I never saw them again. I'm a child of the mountains and my hometown was completely mountainous, so I spent most of my childhood running through the forests and stuff, and one event that happened when I was 10 remains unexplained. I was on top of the ridge several hundreds of feet above my house when I started hearing my biological father yelling. In a very redneck area, he had a very distinct voice with no accent, so it's not really possible to confuse him for anyone else. His voice was coming from the other side of the ridge, which is a bit weird in retrospect because nobody over that way actually lived in that area and everyone avoided everyone in there. Even when hunting, we'd go around. The train was worse to deal with, but it's what we done. He starts calling my name, so I go down there. But the voice isn't getting any closer. I start feeling dread washing over me, and I suddenly remember my father's on a trip to Germany. I've never ran so fast. I didn't realise it until I got to the other side of the ridge, but the forest had been completely silent on the other side of the ridge, which never happens unless there's predators or the wind picks up. Normally, I'd think I was just getting closer to black bear territory, but the voice obviously makes it confusing. Unlike a number of stories like this I've heard over the years, the experience didn't really stop me from going into the woods. It just made me more curious. I've never had an explanation for it since, and it kind of worries me. The closest thing I've heard it could be is like a skinwalker, but I'm not sure. It may even be a person who is trying to stalk me in, but I guess I'll never know. Hey everyone. About 2 weeks ago, I had a really scary experience and my husband didn't believe me, but last night, he had a very similar experience and now we're both wondering what we could have possibly seen. So our puppy was barking to go outside and use the bathroom. It's about 4 or 5 AM. I took him out and stood on the steps of our deck because I didn't want to get my feet wet. My dog was using the bathroom when I looked up and I see something across the yard. It was slowly walking towards me, 1 step at a time. Its eyes were super reflective. I thought it was a deer, but its eyes were so tall and staring at me, and it wasn't running away. I hurried the dog up and we ran inside. I have reoccurring night terrors, so at first, my husband thinks it's just that, but I was crying and shaking and could barely be spoken to. He tells me it's probably a deer, but I wasn't convinced, and I refused to take the dog out after midnight again. As for my husband's experience, it was early in the morning, about 5 AM. The dog was barking and he took him outside. Once again, my husband stood on the deck outside. He didn't have his glasses, but when he looks up, he saw something tall standing in the forest near our backyard. He said he saw it walking slowly, almost gliding. He said that the moment he made eye contact, his nose was bleeding. My husband is typically not prone to them either. He said he wanted to get a closer look but felt the need to go inside, almost like an instinct. My husband's a zookeeper. He's not really afraid of animals and can recognize many of them. I still have no idea what this is. We live in Eastern PA. This happened around the 1900s in the countryside of South Brazil. My grandmother's grandfather was coming home from a ball very late at night. He lived in a small farm, and so to come from the party place he had a long way to walk in the middle of nothing, with just trees and bushes. And well, you can imagine how the countryside of Brazil was, especially back then. He said that while he was walking, all of a sudden, he heard strange noises and lights. Scared, he hid in the bushes to see what was happening. He said there were very little men speaking in a foreign language. Behind him, there was two huge plates stacked on top of another, with lights all over them. He stayed hiding and praying until they left and ran for his life. My grandmother says that she's heard this story a few times in her youth from him, and the narrative always stayed the same, with him praying after. Only after she married and moved to the big city and had children did she start to hear about these things being known as aliens and other things. Her grandfather at the time would have had no concept of aliens. After a heavy night of drinking and camping, we woke up and nobody wanted to make breakfast, so we decided to drive into town and find a diner. We're approaching where the dirt meets the pavement and come up on dozens of sheriffs backloading the road, two of which have rifles pointed towards us. We stop the truck about 40 feet from them and hear them yell over the intercom to stick our hands up now. They then instruct us to approach on foot with our hands in the air. They search my truck and find it full of loaded guns and beer. That's when they tell us that a Forest Service agent had been shot and killed nearby, and eventually let us go, but tell us our camping gear is out of bounds until the murderer is found. We didn't want to leave our camping gear and go home, so we ended up at a nearby casino, continuing partying there. A few hours later, someone in the casino says there's loads of cops outside. We go outside and there must have been 100 sheriffs, local PD everywhere. Apparently, that same murderer had stopped at the casino gas station and an officer recognized him. Then LEO drew his gun, murderer went for his and the LEO shot him dead. We went back to the camp and home the next day. I checked the newspaper articles and they made a map of where the murder happened, and it's only 200 yards away from our campsite. I have a friend who's a trail ranger. He's basically a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking them down and whatnot. The other ranger wasn't feeling well, so he said he was going to head back, but it's a 1-hour ATV ride. My friend finished up the last one when he hears voices. He kept in mind that he's far off the beaten path. He calls out and no one replies. As it was getting dark, he starts to head back and found his ATV won't start. He then realizes that the batteries are not connected. He reconnects it and started to drive but isn't going fast. Less than half a mile later, the whole thing died. He radioed back saying, "Hey guys, someone pick me up." They said they would do it but are gonna take an hour. He said, "Can the other guy come back?" and he said no. So he settled down, made a small fire, but heard voices again. It's dark and he's angry. The voices sound like an argument now. Someone was angry, yelling at someone else who sounded scared. He called out and said, "Does anyone need help?" The voices don't care. He thinks they're less than 1,000 feet away. He radioed again, and they said they're having trouble finding what path he'd be on, and haven't left yet. He said to them just to get another ranger there. About 3 minutes go by, and the voices start again. He decides to walk there, hoping maybe there's some drunk people that have a map. He walks in their direction, but the voices seem to be getting further away as he got closer. Finally, 20 minutes later, he gave up and walks back. He got a radio call, and they said the other guy was passed out, covered in vomit, and was taken to hospital. They don't know exactly where I come from still, because he crossed off everywhere that he went. Then the radio died, and the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decides to listen to what they're arguing about, and picks up on things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take, and I knew you were gonna do this, you idiot, and I don't care." His guess is that two hunters are arguing over a kill. Then he heard something intelligible. Then silence. Bang. A gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that he heard nothing. Just his breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything, and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours but found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, a shallow grave was found, and a man who'd been shot in the head was also found. Thing was, it was a skeleton who had been there for years, so either the argument he heard was somehow from the past, or someone else got murdered recently when he was there. This happened while I was doing my army service in Switzerland. I'm not allowed to talk about exactly what we were doing there, but I'll try and keep this clear. My company has installed a huge antenna, and it has to be guarded day and night. So we're on a hill, away from a city near a massive forest. It's 1800 hours, and I had just started my watch of 6 hours with another soldier. Everything's fine. We smoke cigarettes and keep ourselves occupied until our night watch ends. Then, we receive a call from our superior who said that one of the soldiers that's supposed to watch hasn't come out, and we have to stay for another 6 hours. So we tossed a coin to see who's going to stay from midnight till 6 AM with temperatures of -20. And of course I lost, and I had to wait for the other soldiers to come and join me for the rest of the night. They sent Jon Snow. No, I'm just kidding. They've only sent another soldier, but not the best, because I knew he would sleep all night when I saw him climbing the hill with his sleeping bag. And that's what he did. He immediately took place in the tent and fell asleep. It was the coldest and longest night of my life. Nothing special about it. The weirdest part though happened in the morning. We received another call from our superior telling us that we had an NBC exercise. It means that we have to wear all-day chemical suits. The one with the gas mask and everything. I was really upset and exhausted because I wasn't able to sleep with that thing on, and sleep was my only reward for the 12-hour watch. Well, I get out of this tent, and I saw this thing that still scares me to this day. I see a woman standing next to the antenna. She wasn't moving, she was just standing there, meters from my tent. I couldn't see her face because of the sun starting to rise behind her. I knew she's a woman because she had really long hair. Remember that we're in the middle of nowhere and she's standing there, not moving, like she's frozen. I start to freak out and call the other guy to see what I'm looking at. I don't know why, but he wasn't scared at all, and he told her to leave. But she didn't. She just stood there staring at us. I was confused. How could a woman ignore two soldiers in a forbidden area? I mean, we're in Switzerland. The army's not that impressive, I know, but people usually don't do this kind of thing. They would just move away, especially when it's 6 in the morning. And what she's doing in the middle of nowhere is beyond me, not dressed for cold climate. How long was she there? And how did she get there? I don't even see any footsteps. So, there's so many questions running through my head. The other soldier didn't think twice and starts walking towards her. When he almost reaches her, she starts running very fast into the forest. I see her going deep into the forest and I never see her again. I'm a really rational thinker, but I have absolutely no explanation for this. Thank God there was someone there with me, because nobody would have believed me if it was just me there at that time. My father told me a story many times when I was growing up of something that happened to him. I know he believes it to be true, and he's not a very superstitious person whatsoever. Very analytical on the other hand. My dad was 5 years old, camping with the Boy Scout troop. They sent everyone for firewood. It was dusk, so he went off on his own and a little further than the other kids. He wanted to gather more firewood than anyone else. He got far enough away that nobody else had picked through the fallen wood and started gathering. Along his way, he went until he almost stepped on a tiny tribe of Indians, moving around a fire, dancing. He said they were tiny, and they didn't pay him any attention as he crouched down to look at them. He ran over to go and tell his friends, but by the time he come back, they're all gone. He said he's never seen anything like it in his life, and he was sure someone was playing a prank on him, but how? How could somebody make a prank look that real? I live near a very large, very popular national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the goings on here. Strange sounds, weird creatures, and strange disappearances. I've dealt with these in my past times and hikes, and even just relaxing in the park. Here's one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house that's deep in the Bonnies, and the only road there is a gravel road that's washed away. Without a good car, you're not getting anywhere. My cousins lived in a trailer with their mums, right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games, which mainly involved me getting chased, being the youngest. My grandma was in hospital with my aunt, so our oldest cousin, who I'll call Dee, had to watch us. Dee was, and still is, the only cousin that's older than us that we still hold in high regards. He would mess with us and play around, but actually cared about us. The whole day we were playing around, but we would usually play more at night, like hide and seek, etc. We'd been playing pretty far away from the house and it was starting to get dark. We decided to go back to the house and grab flashlights and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being hunted. So I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property, hiding behind a log. I heard my cousins getting closer, so I ran and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property line, and we saw my cousin Dee. He looked at us and kinda growled. We all run from him, thinking it's a game. We ran back to the gravel road when we saw him walk out of the tree line, but he did in a weird way. Gloatingly, in fact. We ran into the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door, but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it too. As we loudly scooted the table, they come into the living room from the bedroom. We had obviously woke him up, and we said we saw him chasing us, and he got wide-eyed. He said stay in the bedroom. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, and he come in and told us not to worry, that he's just scaring us. It wasn't until 4 years later, when I was 13, he told me the truth. He's pretty certain that it was a skinwalker. He told me he's dealt with it before and was terrified it hunted us, and he was too scared to tell me at the time because I'd get worried. So with a few fraternity brothers and I are backpacking in the Nafala National Park and met some guys. They're locals. I mean, not local hangout bros, but local backwoods people who lived there for generations, hate the government and society types. These are guys that have apparently been helping Eric Rudolph, the Olympic bomber, hide in the national forest by supplying him with food drops. Really weird drunken conversations. They actually took us to one of the hideout drop-off caves. They were too serious, and that's the whole reason that I hated this. They trusted us because some things were said to make them think we're of a similar mindset. Anyway, we parted ways. Spent a few days trying to figure out if it is all lies or not. And that same week, they call Eric Rudolph in the dumpster of a Piggy Wiggly 3 miles from where we met the guys. Every single thing these guys said matched up with the news story. We gave them the bottle of Jack even. They said they'd give it to Eric. Creepy as hell. Hauntingly terrifying in retrospect. So when I was about 5 years old, I was at my sister's graduation party. My father had rented out a pavilion at a heavy wooded area of Country Park. I ended up following some kids throughout the forest, and after a while, I realised I wandered too far from the pavilion and started heading back. I remember not being able to find my way back and ended up being lost for around an hour. As I was walking, a man dressed in white from head to toe appeared to me. He said his name was John. I explained to him that I was lost and told him where my family was. I remember him accompanying me throughout the woods, and he had a very comforting presence about him. After a while, I remembered hearing my uncles calling for me from a distance. I turned to tell John that that's my uncle, but he was gone. I turned the other way, and there was my uncle. I'm 30 now, but can't help wonder exactly what John was and what the meaning of all of this was. I guess I'll write what happened in chronological order. To preface this, I should mention that all of this took place back on my reservation. I'm from Algonquin First Nation from Canada. Another thing I should mention is that on the res, traditional beliefs and legends of the paranormal are still a big part of our community. The attitude of most people towards the paranormal is one of assurance. To us, the paranormal is a regular part of our life. We believe in a spirit world, and we believe that sometimes these beings can cross over from their world to ours. Well, I tell paranormal stories to my non-native friends. They're always in disbelief of what I tell them, but they've had no paranormal experiences, unlike me having a bunch. And most everyone I know on the res has had one. I don't really care to explain it, but it is what it is. Anyway, here's the story. This happened in the fall of 2011 when I was 16 years old. I was living in a nearby city with my mum, so I can get a better education than the one I can get at home. But we'd go back every single week to see my dad and little brother. One Friday, during the drive back home, I got a text from a friend of mine. She told me about a party that was happening that night, and she said to me, when am I going to be home so they can pick me up? I gave her a time, and that was that. When we got home, as soon as we stepped inside the house, I see my dad and cousins sitting at the kitchen table drinking. They're both cops on the res, so usually beers with his partner on a Friday evening happens. Means that they had a particularly tough week at work though. Typically, the toughest cases they deal with are ones around children. So a part of me felt sad immediately that something bad's happened. They both look tired and drained, but they're happy to see us. We say our greetings, catch up a little, and my dad asked me if I have any plans. I tell him about the party and where it will be, and he and our cousin share a weird look. "Why are you guys making that face? Did something happen?" I say. "I dunno, should we tell her?" my cousin said, looking at my dad. He laughed and said, "Yeah, we probably should, because I'm gonna have to be going to a cottage pretty deep in the woods later that evening." They start off by saying the first strange call they get is on a Monday night. There's an elderly woman saying that there's people outside of her home knocking on all of her windows. She can't see anyone, but there must have been at least 3 people, judging by all the different locations of the knocking. They arrive at the woman's home, inspect all around the house, even the woods, but find nothing. They tell her that it's probably some teenagers playing tricks on her, but sadly there's nothing they can do really, besides patrol the area in case they come back. On Wednesday night, the same woman called again with the same problem. It had been raining that day too, and there was mud everywhere, so they figure at least they're gonna know where they went. But they don't find a thing. This is when they start feeling like something is off, because one of the windows where the woman was, she's adamant that there was someone there, but it's completely impossible to get there without going through a huge puddle. This is when they start to think she's lying, but they just told her the same thing they told her friend a few nights prior. By Thursday night, everyone on the res had been talking about these strange experiences. It turns out that she wasn't the only one experiencing it. She was just the one to call. I mean, all of this is taking place on a res, so it wasn't long before people were linking it to the supernatural. My dad still wasn't sure if it's just a group of teens playing a prank on people, but they get another call from the same woman for the same reason. They rush over there, but are met with the same situation, except this time, the neighbour walked over looking pale as a ghost. That's saying something for him. He says, "Is this about the knock-in?" They notice he's a little shaky. "Yeah. Did you see something?" they ask him, and he nods and said, "You guys are gonna think I'm crazy, but yeah." And he goes on to explain what he saw. He said he stepped out for a cigarette on his front porch when he heard knocking. He looked around to see where it's coming from, and when he looked to his neighbour's house, he saw it. There's a black figure standing outside of the woman's window. The same one with the puddle, looking at her home. He said it looked humanoid in stature, but completely made out of a shadow. You could tell it was something solid-ish, but you cannot make out any features on it. He stared at it completely in shock, and watched that thing as it knocked a couple of times, then darted around the house knocking on every window, moving so quick it's like a blur, and it went around the house a few times. The man ran across the road into the tree line, behind one tree in particular. The man was frozen but couldn't look away. It then leaned out from behind the tree, staring directly at him with yellow eyes that reflected the light similar to a cat's, and then it smiled, showing its small but numerous pointed sharp teeth. "I almost had a heart attack," he said while it happened. Fast forward to Friday. Stories are being exchanged all over the res about sightings and experiences people are having. On top of that, multiple people are experiencing the knock-in. There's also quite a few sightings with everyone describing the creature in the same way. One woman was bringing her trash to the side of the road, and she thought she saw the woman somewhere in her peripheral vision standing near the trees. She walks back up the driveway and into her home, feeling as though she's being watched. Right before she's about to open her door to go back inside to her home, she looked back and saw 2 reflective yellow eyes staring at her from the trees, saying it's about 5 feet above the ground. Another couple was driving at night and said they saw a humanoid figure too. "You sure you still want to go to that party?" my dad asked. But my friends were already pulling into the driveway. I gave my family hugs and kisses goodbye, and they told me to be careful, but I felt fine. A common belief among native people is that negative energy attracts negative energy. Therefore, an evil spirit will draw to people with unresolved issues, traumas, and sinners, I suppose. If you're someone who's spiritual, self-aware, and basically a good person, you're pretty good. So I get to the party, and within 20 minutes, the conversation shifts towards the paranormal experiences everyone's having. I'm really curious about what everyone has to say, because they have stories that I haven't heard yet, but my friend, being 17 and all, couldn't hold her alcohol very well, and was crying about how she wishes she was closer with her brother. I'm trying to make her feel better while listening to everyone else's stories. One of the people from the party was related to the neighbour of the woman who was calling the police. The experience really shook him up, and my friend was just explaining everything that was going on. For one, he smudged his entire home, which is something people do for extra protection from the paranormal. He also went on multiple visits to the elders around the community asking for advice. What we do know about paranormal experiences on the res is that they don't happen as much as they used to. If you talk to one of our elders, they'll have endless stories and even more advice to give about how to protect yourself. One of the explanations that was given to us is that the shadow guy is evidence that someone was doing unauthorized shaky tent ceremony. If you don't know what that is, it's basically like an Ouija board session that takes place inside of a tent. People stand around the tent while the medicine man or medicine woman goes inside asking questions. The tent begins to shake and you hear voices of the spirits coming through. I've never personally been to one because we haven't had a good enough reason to make one, but typically our ancestors use shaken tent ceremonies when they're starving in the dead of winter and need some direction on where the nearest food is. My mum's been to one. Her story's crazy. She described hearing multiple men and women only speak in native tongue, and they're upset that people were doing a shaken tent ceremony when they're not on the verge of death. The people there had to explain that they're only doing the ceremony to prove that it was real, as we'd been losing our culture as a result of residential schools. But the spirits are angry, saying that the bridge between the two worlds should never be opened unless necessary, because you don't know who you're talking to. It could be evil spirits. You don't know. Anyway, the elders told him that this spirit crossed over into our world because of a shaken tent ceremony. Someone on the res has been doing them without consultation of the elders, so we start thinking about who would do that without the proper guidance, and so. Then, two of the drunkest dudes say, "Oh, I'm not scared. That thing can't do anything," basically egging it all on, and we're all looking at each other like, why would you disrespect an evil spirit? That's exactly how it's attracted to you. And that's when I decided to leave the sunroom where everyone's hanging out. I went to the living room to console my drunk crying friend when I noticed the rocking chair outside of the porch moving. I slowly moved away, refusing to make direct eye contact, but I do in my peripheral vision. Anyway, I'm inside the cottage and I keep seeing this rocking chair moving back and forth. But another thing we've raised to do in our culture is to ignore paranormal. Spirits feed on energy people give towards them, so if you freak out, if you get angry, if you start crying or yell at it, that's exactly what it wants. It thrives on energy of any kind. So while I knew something messed up was happening, I wasn't about to pay attention. 5 minutes now go by and I still see it out the corner of my eye. That's when my friend screams and she runs on the other side of the sunroom. My other friend, too, sprints to the girl, number 1, who's sitting and busts through the French doors onto the balcony. All of this happens in a split second, but I immediately go to the patio and ask what's going on. Girl 1 is crying on the couch with friends all around her. She claims to have seen the spirit. She said she was listening to the boys talk about the spirit when she saw boy 2's face as he was looking onto the balcony behind her. She turned around to see what he's looking at, and directly on the other side of the window was the shadow spirit on the rocking chair smiling at her, literally 3 feet away from her. That's when boy 2 sprinted towards it and burst through the French doors. I walk outside to find boy 2, and he's on the lawn, staring into the woods. I call his name and he looks up. All he says is, "Get everyone inside." And the tone of his voice makes me scared. I get all of us inside the cottage. This is when the phrase, "Come at me, bro," was gaining popularity. So you can imagine the drunk kid yelling that into the woods. It's terrible. I eventually get everyone inside. Boy 2 comes inside and tells everyone to clean up and that we should leave as soon as possible. Everyone has trash bags and we're clearing away the beer cans and whatever. Everyone goes inside the cottage and it's only me and boy 2 in the sunroom now. I look to him for answers and he says, "It's outside." I nod and start cleaning faster. The sooner we're out of here, the sooner we get away from that thing. As we're cleaning in the sunroom, we hear knocking on multiple windows. The entire sunroom's made of glass, but it's dark out, so you can't even see. And he says ignore it. I'm really scared now. Within 2 seconds, someone comes running out of the bathroom and says, "I'll kill whoever's knocking on the bathroom window." But everyone's accounted for. Someone else comes running out of the bedroom saying that there was knocking on the window as well. Everyone's freaking out, and me and boy 2 and our one other friend are the only sober ones now trying to calm people. We get the place clean and get outside and to the cars immediately. Everyone's getting into the trucks and I'm standing there. The guy looks relaxed, then all of a sudden looks worried and shoves me inside his truck. We peel out of there quick. A few days later, I end up hanging out with boy 2 and he tells me the story from his perspective. He said that when the boys started talking about the spirit, it appeared on the rocking chair behind girl 1. He said he made eye contact with it but couldn't look away. They were staring at each other, and that's when girl 1 and boy 2's expression changed. He said it was instinct to defend the people he's with and ran towards it. He said that the feeling he was getting from the cockgee was almost like daring him to do something. He said the second he got up, the cockgee stood up and ran into the woods, disappearing into a blur of the tree line. Boy 2 ran off the porch, looking around the lawn, when he saw it standing there, right next to the woods. It was smiling at him, and he heard it mocking him, calling his name, then disappearing. He didn't see it again until everyone was getting inside the trucks, which explains why he suddenly pushed me inside. He said it was standing on the far end of the truck, super close to us. Later that night, when he dropped everyone off, they realized that they never locked the doors. So he went back to the cottage, but his friend was too scared to go in, so he goes in on his own. But the second he opens the door, he sees that thing standing inside. He locks the door as quick as he can, and they peel out of there. The sightings continued for a few days after that. We definitely weren't the only people on the res to have them kind of experiences. It was the talk of the res. Everyone was curious about what happened. Would it come back? What was it? All I know is that it terrified us, and it's 2018 now, and no one else has seen anything like it since. My husband and I live in central Virginia. This particular part of the state is where Virginia's western mountains just begin rising up from the ground. We live in a rural area. In total, there are 4 houses on our road, and 4 on another road directly behind ours which run parallel. All of these properties sit on at least 2 acres. 2 of them are situated on 5+ acres, so lots of space. Other than these 8 homes, the surrounding area is heavily wooded, but there are a number of footpaths winding through the surrounding woods. The main path is a loop that mends around or through the 8 properties with smaller trails veering off of it. Most of these offshoot trails are reconnected in the loop, but some just end. Others, however, continue deeper to the forest. When we moved in 5 years ago, we thought the paths would be perfect for our dog walkers, to use them when she came to let our dogs out during the week. Diane was excited to learn about the paths. She's outdoorsy to begin with, and also lives in a rural area, so her comfort level walking the paths was high. I worked from home one day, but Diane come to walk the dogs anyway because I wasn't sure I'd have a solid break in order to do so. When she arrived, we waved a quick hello to one another, but she knew I was busy, so she leashes up the dogs and headed out. 30 minutes later I took a quick break and was there to greet Diane and the other dogs at the back door. I asked her how the walk went, and she told me about what she found in the woods that day. There was a path she noticed prior to this particular day she had never taken but planned to do so at some point. She noted it was significantly less worn than some of the other trails and assumed this may have been because it is a deeper trail, but wasn't sure. From the main path looking through the trees, she said you could tell this trail eventually reached what looked like a small clearing deeper in the woods. Deciding today was the day, she just headed down the path with the dogs trotting alongside her. The dogs reached a clearing first and stopped. They were focused on something from front of them she couldn't yet see. She reaches the entrance to the clearing and lifted her gaze in the same direction as the dogs, and said the hair on the back of her neck immediately rose. Centered in the clearing was Stump. A few inches from the base there stood perfectly spaced rings of animal skulls. Deers, cows, rabbits, birds and others, some of which she couldn't even identify. On the top of the stump more skulls are arranged, one on top of the other, also in ring formation. She said this arrangement looked like it must have taken hours, being close to 2 feet in height. In some places rocks or sticks were placed to ensure every skull was properly supported. Diane's reactions kicked in, and she bolts back to the trail and then to the home as fast as possible. It's not unusual for my neighbours to hunt. My husband and I frequently hear gunshots on the weekends, especially during hunter's season. Neither of us hunt, so I asked my friend's husband, who has hunted here in his entire life, if something was going on. He said he knew nothing, though, and was as confused as we were. I'm getting kind of worried. I mean, there could potentially be a psychopath or cult out there, really close to where I live. From roughly 2000 to 2005, I lived on the south edge of Northern Virginia. This was a rural area with houses set far apart from each other, surrounded by fairly dense woods. There was a phenomenon that I came to call the woods walkers. Due to insomnia, I had a bad tendency to stay up very late at night, sometimes all the way until dawn. I literally did that yesterday. Frequently I'd leave the window partially open all night to let in a cool breeze. On some occasions late at night, or after midnight, I'd hear something loudly crashing through the woods behind the house. It always sounded like a large man staggering drunkenly through the woods, always along the same path from the same direction down towards the Bull Run River. The leaves would be rustling very loudly, as if a large person was carelessly dragging their feet along the ground. Branches would be snapping as if the person was lunching blindly through the forest. I couldn't tell if it was one person or several, but the passing through the woods always created an alarming amount of noise. I came to expect to hear the woods walkers every 2 weeks or so. After a while, whenever I heard the noise of the wood walkers, I would peer out of the window trying to discern who or what would be making all the sounds at such a late hour. I never saw a thing, no outlines of figures nor a glow from a flashlight or cigarette. The really strange thing about this is that the apparent path they were traversing came from nowhere and went nowhere. They just stumbled through the woods, apparently tearing their own path through the wilderness, going deeper into the woods. It's also bizarre that they would go crashing deep through the woods at 2 or 3 a.m. when it's literally pitch black without a sort of light. It seems impossible to me that anybody could find their way through the woods in the dark like that. On one particular occasion, I heard the woodwalkers behind the house. Then I heard a bunch of gunshots from directly behind it. It sounded to me like a handgun, maybe a 9mm or a .38 special. The next morning I wandered around the edge of the yard searching for expended brass, but didn't find anything. I found no traces or signs of anyone, in fact. In the days after the gunshots, I became increasingly determined to solve the strange mystery of the woods walkers. I put a flashlight on the small dresser by my door. I patiently waited night after night to hear the woodwalkers come staggering through the woods, and sure enough, one night I heard the familiar sound of something crashing eerie and slowly through the woods behind the home. I leap up and rush to gather the things I need to carry outside with me as I went to confront whatever it was passing through the woods. I frantically pulled off my sweatpants and put on my jeans, searched for my keychain, then unlocked the lunchbox where I keep my pistol, loaded the ammunition to the pistol and tucked it into my belt. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly descended to my basement, then out to the back door into the backyard. It took me far too long to get outside. Now, by the time I cautiously strode out under the moonlight, I could hear noisy movements of the woodwalkers reaching the distance. I walked slowly and stealthily over to the edge of the woods and pulled out my pistol from my belt. I crept soundlessly down the hill into the dark woods. I positioned myself behind a large tree in case the woodwalkers carried firearms. I peered warily in the direction of the sound. My eyes are strained to see whatever's out there, but I discerned nothing through the shadowy branches of the forest. After a while I point my flashlight towards the direction of the noise and turn it on. My night vision was instantly ruined by the reflection of the light from the tangled mass of trees and branches. I turned the light off and listened to the sound of the woodwalkers fade away. I went back inside in defeat. To this day, I have no idea what they were or why they targeted me. I took a gap semester a couple of years ago and decided that I should take a road trip with a buddy who was also taking a semester off from school. We're from the Midwest and planned our trip to take a big circle from Ohio to LA, up to Portland and back home again. We're outdoorsy guys, so we knew we're trying to hit some wilderness along the way. So we're about a month into the trip and leaving Portland, where we are taking a break from camping every night while on the road. Itching to get back on the road and into the wilderness, my buddy finds that the hike looks interesting. It was an abandoned railroad about 2 hours east of Portland. He found the GPS coordinates on some site and said that there's an abandoned railway with a couple of tunnels and a massive trestle bridge that spanned huge gorges. It sounded really cool. So we drive my Volvo station wagon towards the coordinates. If you've ever been to Oregon, it's beautiful, foggy, never-ending views of thick pine forests. The type of place that you can barely see 20 feet in any direction because of the density of the trees. For the last hour of this 2-hour drive, we're driving on dirt logging roads, haven't passed a single car or seen any sign of life since turning off a rural highway. It was creepy, endlessly dark. Stop. I hit the brakes. My buddy squinting at his phone. Looks like we're at the coordinates. I pull off to the side of the one-lane road and put the Volvo in park. The dense trees are still all around us, but I can barely see up ahead, and there is a linear gap in the canopy. I guess that's the railroad. We hop out of the car and I load up my day pack with my camera, headlamp, water, pepper spray, knife. After second thought, I put the knife in my pocket. The railroad's been abandoned for about 50 years. This means that while you can still see the tracks while standing on them, thick brush has filled it in entirety. It is nearly filled in the space between the rails except for a foot-wide path that has been maintained by elk, deer and bears. I notice my buddy is also looking at a private property sign. This is fading into a tree. He looks at me and I shrug and we start walking. The tracks are dead straight. This means that we can see a couple 100 yards down the center of this valley tunnel of vegetation, as if I'm in a very narrow alley that never ends. To either side, I can hardly see 10 feet in front of me. We walk and walk. Honestly, a boring hike considering there's no view and it was dead straight. But we continue. We know the tunnel's ahead. I kept myself busy trying to pace my stride with each railroad tire. Step after step, we walk about 3 miles away from the car, into the woods. Suddenly I stop and my body bumps into my backpack. I had just looked up from my feet and was staring into a looming tunnel ahead of us covered in moss. The entrance surrounded a black hole that went right into the mountainside. Again we shrug and turned on our headlamps before going in. Graffiti covered everything that wasn't moss, and moss was straight up covering the areas that are covered by graffiti. Our headlamps are dimly lit, but we can see walls covered with graffiti. I stare eye to eye with a 20-foot wide mummy. Now I can barely see my hand in front of my face because of the darkness, and we couldn't yet see the end of the tunnel. Drips of water echo off the walls and my buddy and I quickly walked down the track in silence. I had my knife out on my side. I was relieved to get out. From the exit of the tunnel I could already see a massive gorge up ahead. The tracks went across the bridge that screamed PNW. It was easy to forget about the creepiness of the tunnel, and I looked forward to busting out my camera. Once I set foot on the bridge, I realized the danger of crossing something that hadn't been maintained in 50 years. The wood was clearly aged and rotten in some places, but the view's incredible. We balanced on the steel tracks and walked over to the center of the trestle, where we could see the river 500 feet below us. Horrible logging scarred the mountainsides along the gorge. I noticed a place where the boards had broken through. I hope nobody's fallen. Instead of turning back after getting some good shots, we keep going. The sun was getting into late afternoon now, and was blocked by the steep mountains around us. We quickly walked off the bridge and back into the green tunnel, but for some reason, I started having second thoughts. I don't know why or where they came from, but I slow my pace and start thinking about how can I ask my buddy to turn around. Before I was going to turn around and ask Nate, I glanced up ahead at the tracks. Directly ahead, about 200 yards away, someone's eyes are looking at me. I stop in my tracks and feel a cold rush to my hands and head. The person staring has stopped now. I see another man's head poke around. It's two of them, I whisper to Nate. Slowly we start walking down the green tunnel towards the men. They're walking towards us. As we get closer, I walk faster out of fear. Bouncing on my man's chest is a large bush knife. He's wearing filthy clothes, has a long matted beard, and has not broken eye contact. A revolver is tucked into his pants, and he's carrying a rifle with a magazine. At this point, it's too late to turn back, and I realise that my buddy and I are gonna have to squeeze by these men through the narrow gap between the tracks. The brush is pulling up my sleeves. How's it going? I ask nervously, as I squeeze by the men holding eye contact. I count 4 guns and the stench of body odour. I'm unsettled by the way these guys look. I got a gut feeling I've never felt before. They say nothing can go past us. I kept hurrying away. And before I know, they're out of sight when I look behind me past Nate. I turn to Nate and give him my what the hell look. After walking silently for 10 minutes, we stop. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to walk deeper in, but I also didn't want to walk back towards where the creepy dudes are going. Suddenly loud moaning and shrieks start coming from the dense woods off to the side. It sounded like it's 100 yards away. It doesn't sound human, but it sounds like it's in agony. This is the final straw. We bolt back towards the car. I'm no runner, but we ran over the bridge like my life depended on it. Through the black tunnel and through the endless green that surrounds us. Finally I see the logging road up ahead where the car's parked. I stop running where I hear a truck idling. I can start to see it through the brush. A big old F330 lifted pickup truck idling behind my car. The station wagon looks comically small in comparison. I can see the 2 men sitting in the truck with the doors open and guns out staring at us waiting. Nate and I both shrug to each other, but this time with fear in our eyes. Just get in the car, I scream. We hop in, and I stare at the men in the rearview mirror. We wait. My heart is pounding. Are they gonna kill us? I think they might do. I grab the knife and pepper spray. After waiting for what feels like an hour, the men haven't taken their eyes off of us and we can't back up given how close they are. I notice a fairly solid looking shoulder to the side of the road on my right, and I decide to try and pull in to do a quick U-turn to get away. So that's what I did. Turned the wheel all the way and floored it. Thankfully my car made the turn and was able to clear the back of the truck. We drove as fast as we could down the logging road in silence. No truck behind us. Dust pluming as we ride away. I drive all the way back to Idaho that night and had my eye on the rearview mirror the whole time. So this happened last year in Virginia, and is also the reason I never backpack alone anymore. I was talking to one of my friends, and ended up taking a summer course at the time, and we ended up with a 3-day weekend in June, so I thought it was a great time to go and explore some of the Virginia wilderness and all. I did a Google search and found a state park with a trail that looked nice and let my roommate and family know that I'm going to be going on a certain trail. When I got close to the park area, I saw a little outdoor shop where people liked hiking the Appalachian Trail stop. I went in to grab a map of the area just in case I get lost. As I was talking to the owner, he mentioned a trail that's not very well known, but has a pretty cool waterfall and swimming hole. This piqued my interest, so I showed him my map and he pointed to where it was. It took me outside the state park, but he said it's a great place to go. I paid for the map and thanked the owner. I texted my roommate and parents about the trail, and I parked my car and set off for the adventure. I should note that The waterfall was going to be a side trip from my journey. I was planning 3 days and 2 nights. I started on the Appalachian Trail and it was pretty packed with people, and some of them were really fun to talk to. As expected, as I got further and further from the main trails, I see less and less people. Around early afternoon, 3 miles from my destination, I noticed it was unnaturally silent. No birds, no bugs, not even wind. I had a feeling of being watched. I shook it off as me overanalyzing the situation. I got to the waterfall and it wasn't too spectacular, but it was cool to look at. Plus it had a good sized area to swim in, so naturally I stripped down to my bare minimum and went swimming. It was pretty refreshing. As I was getting my clothes back on, I started whistling to myself. That's when I heard something whistle the same tune back. I thought it's a bird copying me, so I went back and forth with it, and it will repeat whatever I whistled. I thought it was pretty neat. As I was setting up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and again, I'd get goosebumps and my hairs would stand up. As night fell, I built a small fire and lit my jet boil to make dinner. As I did so, I became hyper aware that I was being watched or that something was wrong. I then realized that there was no sound, only deafening silence. Some part of my brain was telling me that I'm not safe and to leave. I just ignored it and crawled into my tent with my flashlight and book. I went to sleep without incident. When I woke up the next morning, my sight was trashed. My camp stool was nowhere to be found. My bear bag with my food was cut down and the contents were thrown across the site. Now my first thoughts are that a crafty animal has actually chewed through the rope and got to the bag, but I look at the rope and it was cut with something very sharp. Plus, none of the food was touched. I also noticed bare footprints around my campsite. Keep in mind I'm at least 6 to 8 miles from a road. As I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap off in the distance. I turned to look and see nothing. I look again. I still see nothing, but I heard whistling again. The same whistle from yesterday, but it was different. It sounded more sinister. It made my hair stand up on the back of my neck, and this is when I listened to my instincts to get out of there. It sounded like it was a little off in the distance, so I packed up as fast as I could. The whistle got closer as I finished stuffing the tent into my bag. It didn't bother me that I wasn't putting stuff away properly. The whistling was constant and sounded like it was coming from all directions. I got fed up with the whistling and yelled into the woods, "Shut up and do what you want." It stopped whistling and it gone back to being quiet for a moment. Then it repeated in my voice. It sounded like me but distorted, like coming from an old TV. After I heard this, I immediately threw my pack on and ran the direction I came. I heard it moving just behind me, fast, switching and whistling in my voice. I felt like it was toying with me, not coming too close, but not being too far. Eventually it sounded like it got further and further away from me, when it suddenly stopped. When it stopped, I stopped and turned around. I wished I didn't because I heard the most bone-chilling screech I've ever heard coming from right next to me. That's when I started running back. Less than half a mile into the run, I see a couple that was also backpacking. They saw the look of terror on my face. They asked me what's wrong, and saying who is screaming and if I'm okay. I tell them what happened, and they decide not to go down there, or where I just come from. We moved to a more populated area of the trail. As soon as I got back to my car, I drove to the park ranger station reporting what happened. Since the site was off of their area, they couldn't even do anything. The ranger station parking lot ran right up to the woods. When I was getting into my Jeep, I heard the Chill Bill tune coming from the woods just in front of me. I never drove so fast in my life. When I told my roommate why I was back, he said you should never go there alone again. The weirdest thing that ever happened to me was one day while I was backpacking through the woods. I can remember I went to lean up against a tree and stop for a moment. There was a huge tree I was leaning against. As I do so, I hear someone scream my name. I look around and it's coming from in front of me. I get up and immediately run towards the area, thinking maybe someone I know is in trouble. Just as I do, I hear the loudest crash behind me that I've ever heard in my life, and to my disbelief, the entire tree that I was just leaning on has come down directly where I was sitting. I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I'm sure my guardian angel was there with me. Every summer or so, my family travels up north to our friend's property. Father's old boss, to be exact. He lives on a rather large 80 acres of Washington woods, half of which is his gold mining operation consisting of many old machines and gigs. The other half, dense thick woods, unoccupied and closed off to the public. Curiosity and integrity brought both of us together. We do lots of hikes on the property where it's unkept and overgrown, just to see what's there. After all, nature is wildly beautiful. One warm day we began the uphill hike to explore the woods, only to come across a trail that looked rather frequented, even being at quite a high altitude in the middle of nowhere. Following the trail, we stumbled across lots of old tools left behind by miners on the way back. Then we saw cabins, not one, not two, but three. These cabins were nearly collapsed and very old. Fears and dangers aside, we had to explore them, of course. While going in one at the time, we stepped into a very surreal world. Old bottles, bed frames and vintage stoves, probably all from the late 18 to 1900s. One of the old cabins, unfortunately, was far too unstable to look in. The experience as a whole was like stepping back 100 years and seeing how these men worked hand and foot for gold, leaving all of this stuff behind. Another experience on this property was of seeing the aftermath of one of America's most disturbing times, slavery. Near our campsite lay thousands, and I don't exaggerate, thousands and thousands of boulders, each weighing 100 pounds. The owner of the property tells me that many years ago, in the early days, hundreds of Chinese slaves were forced to move these boulders from dig sites around the property, all converting to one spot. While to you, I'm sure it does not sound that creepy, but the emotional gravity you experience while standing on a mountain of boulders easily 20 feet tall that someone's forced to move and make by hand is not something I would want to convey accurately. I do camp on his site often despite the multiple hour drive, and every time I pass those damn rocks I'm hit with heavy feelings of sad emotions. I had recently discovered that I really enjoy driving the slew of back roads that twist and wind through the hills around the Blue Ridge Parkway. One particular stretch nearing the Blind Rock and Bone has about 18 miles of unbroken mountain driving. It's such a noodle spill. It takes a good 45 minutes to navigate through the switchback. I don't know why they described it that way. One morning, I was out on a sunrise drive along that particular stretch. Keep in mind that the sides of this two-lane road are a rock face to one side and a sheer drop to the other. There's very limited opportunities to turn around in the entire 18-mile stretch. If you're forced to turn back, it's a pretty risky three-point turn, and there's no pulling off to the side and whipping around real quick. Well, I was about 6 miles in. It's about 6:30 AM and I hadn't seen another soul out driving the back roads to this day. As my tendencies lean, I was tearing through the curves about as fast as I can manage without risk. Out of nowhere, a black Cadillac rolls up. I didn't see it come up behind me, it was just kind of there. I'm already breaknecking down this road and he's down on me. The windows are tinted very dark, so I decide to pull off along the cliffside and let the vehicle pass. As it did, I could see nothing of the occupants. That's when I noticed the plates. The numbers looked as though they're changing. Like a digital clock gone haywire. And that's if you can call it that. I didn't recognize a single character that was blipping in and out. I sat there for a second and gained my composure. It didn't seem right, but I figured maybe it's just a trick of early morning fog lights. I got back on the road and began to drive. Not a mile later, a black Cadillac comes once again roaring up behind me. It had the same blacked out windows, same everything, right down to the flickering license plate, but it could not be the same one. I would have definitely seen it turn around to get behind me, but this is different, yet fully identical to the first. At this point, I'm just confused more than anything. Stranger things happen than this, so I let it pass and proceed onwards. About a mile later, I see it appear in my rear view, and I mean appear as if I wished it into existence. It was suddenly just there, identical to the first. It happened twice more that drive, and I've never seen anything like it since. I have this thing when I'm sleeping in the wilderness, like if bears or predatory animals are near or watching me, I sense it, first like a dream, but more of an intense awareness that wakes me up. I felt this thing watching me as I woke up and saw it. It took the form of the lady that was camping in the same campground, but it wasn't her. It wasn't human at all. And it had this horrible, evil, hungry, almost grinning expression that is difficult to describe. It was just staring at me, and I just felt like it wanted in. It wanted me bad. As this was happening, I realized my friend's awake. I was just starting out on the trip when I heard him say from behind me, "Can I help you?" I look over and he was starting to stand up with a knife, looking in the same direction as the thing. At that moment I was like, oh god, it's real. I was looking like, dude, what the hell's going on? But he says nothing. He said, go back to sleep. I lie awake until the sun comes up. He didn't really want to talk about it, but he finally told me he heard this huge heavy stomp coming towards our tents with chains, and when he got up, he looked at whatever this thing was, and it's sort of a luminous whitish hazy figure. When he confronted it, it vanished. This happened on the Green River in western Washington. This site was an old mining town back in the 1800s, and there was an explosion caused by a miner that went crazy and purposely set the mine on fire with hundreds of miners inside. Now, I didn't learn about the history of the place until after I'd already went there. The Green River serial killer was also active at the time I was camping there. So this story was told to me by a childhood friend's dad. Me and my friends had known each other for quite some time. Most of the time he lived in town. This is an 8,000 populated town, literally in the dead center of Illinois. On the edge of town, on a country highway, there's a remnants of a small pig farm and slaughterhouse which is now run down, the land of which his family used to hunt on in the 80s. Cue our 8th grade year, and he tells me he's moving out of the country to a new neighborhood that is being built, upscale homes. His dad has been promoted at the local power plant. That's a mile from the slaughterhouse. I started staying out at his gas much more than usual because, well, it's awesome. Lots of money went into it. We would explore the woods during the day. This was in about 98 and 99. We'd then spend our nights listening to music and messing with the Yahoo group chats. Anyway, one day out in the woods we come across a pond of decent size, and there's an island in the middle. My friend sees this and immediately goes pal, tells me we gotta go and hightails it without telling me why. I keep asking him what's going on, but he won't answer me. We finally get back to his house and his parents are settling in. We then come through the garage. They see his face and ask what's wrong, and he tells his dad he found the pond. His dad looks sick, and again I say, what's going on? Now his dad is pretty straightforward, not really a sense of humour kind of guy either, and would only enjoy a glass of expensive whiskey in the mood. He decides now is one of those moods. After getting his glass and taking a sip, he makes us promise to stay away from there, telling us his story. When he was younger, his dad took him and his brother to hunt out there. This incident happened when he's about 19 and well seasoned. They got out there early and decided to set up by his pond. Slow day, only a couple of deer that weren't worth seeing. Started to get the idea of going to a new spot. They then hear a rustling from outside the pond across from them. It's a wolf. But those aren't here. Not a thing in our area. At least not capable of walking to the pond. Looking at it while investigating, it stands up on its hind legs. It walks back the way it come into the water, swim into the middle, but walked up to the island now, again on its legs, standing up before lying down and appearing to fall asleep. They decide to wait to make sure it was out, then slowly back out, getting back to the truck as quick as possible, never going back there to hunt again. Again, this was told to me quite some time ago, but it's always stuck with me. My friend's dad never joked with us. He never seemed to have much of a sense of humour at all, never scared of anything, and never made another person laugh. It really terrified me, seeing everybody look so scared when I had no idea what was going on. A few years ago, my friends and I went on a 45-mile 3-night kayaking trip down the Green River in Kentucky, which runs above the Mammoth Cave System, the world's longest known cave system with more than 400 miles of passages. We brought everything we needed in our kayaks and one canoe, food, tents and water filtrations, etc., and camped each night on the riverbank when it started getting dark and we found level enough ground. The first night was uneventful, except to say there is nothing like a wall of fireflies against a mountainous black tree line in the middle of nowhere. The second day around sunset, after a long day of kayaking and baking in the July heat, we came off on a stream on the bank that opened up into a large ravine. The stream, as we found out, was a cave spring pouring out blue freezing cold cave water into a lagoon, about 30 feet wide, and so deep the blue water turned black after a few feet. The lagoon had a long sandy beach, secluded by hills on either side and a tall overhang cliff behind and above us. It was beautiful, otherworldly looking. Time moved slowly there. We decided to camp there for the night. The sand is soft, white and very fine, ideal for ground sleeping. For some reason the place deeply frightened me, but I didn't speak up. We're all tired and everyone's having fun. We built a small fire and enjoyed the stars throughout the leafy canopy for a while before everyone goes to bed. I slept hard that night, around 5 AM. I woke up with an urge to relieve myself. It's still dark. I had the tent door zipper about halfway opened, and just put my head out when I heard a loud and terrifying roar and scream. I immediately cowered back into my tent, zipping it up quick, and waited. The scream came from about 10 feet to my left, near the dwindling fire. It's high-pitched, but not like an owl scream. It was a wretched pain scream that got lower at the end. Being in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky, most likely it's from a fox or boar, or some kind of bird, but whatever it is, it made me lay awake for hours listening. I heard absolutely nothing. Granted, we're on a soft beach, but I didn't hear a single twig snap or a leaf crinkle when whatever it was finally shuffled away. I should mention at this time that up the beach and off to the side of the lagoon was a small dry cave opening maybe 3 feet wide. I cannot say with any certainty that it was not some ancient cave-dwelling creature that surfaced to investigate our camp. I somehow fell back to sleep and awoke the next morning shaken. I asked my friends if they've heard the terrible scream, but nobody has. We pressed on down the Green River. The third night at dusk, we came upon a large rocky beach. We pulled our boats ashore and decided that this will have to do, as we don't want to go in further and get the risk of being stuck in the water at dark. This rocky beach was where the river splits in two, and in the middle formed a collection of pale rocks, tall grass and dried out wood. A desolate pile with much the size of a football field. The landmass is covered in jumping sand spiders and tiny frogs, again otherworldly. We set up camp, ate, and went to bed around the same time. It's silent for around another half hour until I'm asleep. Suddenly though, my dreams are interrupted by what sounded like a loud boom, mechanical wooden beast. I awoke and shot up immediately. This is truly the loudest thing that I've ever heard in my life. It sounded like a massive bulldozer tearing down a huge steel wooden building. Then came a boom, followed by its echo throughout the river valley. The animal shifted and the birds flew away. We're all awoken by the crashing, yelling and confusion to each other in our tents. Nothing but silence followed outside our tents, and no one was particularly willing to shine a flashlight towards the woods. Eventually, we all decided to fall in tree and go back to sleep. The next morning, I thought about it some more. It didn't sound just like a tree falling. I must stress it had a metallic quality, and it was projected purposefully like a roar. In the morning, we find no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, nor any obvious fallen trees that could have made such a loud sound, so we pack up and head out onto the river one last time to head home. My friends and I still talk about that trip and all the weird things that happened. We did the same kayak trip a couple of years later, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. I'm an avid hunter and love to go hiking, so the outdoors is nothing new to me. For as long as I can remember, I've been exploring. I love all the different things you can find outside. I like the smells of the plants, the sounds of the creatures, the nightfall, and how beautiful the stars are outside. I really think I've learned a lot about myself through camping. I'm really improved on lots of different aspects of my life. Now, there was one night about 3 years ago, I went out camping on my own. I wanted to work on some of my primitive hunting skills and just get away from the stress of life. I've been working so hard and felt trapped for a while, so finally getting out was a great thing to me. And I was having a great day. I caught some small animals and was cooking them on my fire. I'd done some reading and wrote in my notes. Something else that helps clear my mind. Now I looked towards my fire and realised that it's starting to go out a bit. So I put some firewood on and decided to trek out and try and get some more wood before nightfall. I know there's going to be a couple of potentially dangerous animals, but I'm not scared because I have my gun and I've seen none in the area. So I begin trekking out when something catches my attention not too far in. There seems to be a hunter's cabin up ahead. I think that's odd because I've never really seen anything like it before. I call out and say, "Hey, is anyone out there?" half expecting someone to be like, "Yeah," and have a good conversation with me. But I'm wrong. I'm only met by my own echoes. I have my gun holstered so I don't feel too scared, and I slowly make my way up there. As I'm going up there, I can hear a voice now, very faintly, almost like a whisper. I just assume it sounds more distant because I'm further away. I eventually get there and am disappointed to discover that it's been abandoned, and I mean for a long time. It looks like this place hasn't been used since the 1950s at least. I look in there and there's not much. An old banjo, decaying massively, unplayable, some old pictures that you can't see into, and some mouldy cups. I decide to leave. Luckily I find some firewood just close to it. I'm glad I got firewood and can go back to my camp. I don't realise how dark it's gotten outside. As I'm returning, I start to hear a sound. I think, oh, that's weird, my phone's playing music. I then glance down and realise that my phone's still off. I've kept it this way to conserve its battery, so I stop for a moment. I then realise what I can hear is almost like a stringed instrument. It sounds like it's coming from behind me. I then hold my breath to be dead silent, and what I hear, I still have no explanation for to this day, and shakes me to my core even thinking about. I can hear the sound of a banjo being played from the cabin. I'm so scared that I don't even bother gathering up my things. I simply run out of there back to my car, and have this horrible feeling that I'm being followed the whole way back home. I to this day will never go camping in that part of the woods again. It's the most scary thing I have ever experienced in my life, and I never want to feel again. I had a bizarre experience while I was camping on Apocaly State Park beach. It's a small stretch of beach with a lagoon on one side and the Gulf of Mexico upon the other. I was setting up closer to the Gulf side, enjoying the stars, just relaxing in my tent at night. This is towards the end of a solo cross-country trip I was on. I had camped all over the country over the previous 35 days, and had never experienced anything too scary happening to me. But while I'm laying there, Almost simultaneously, the wind goes completely dead on the ocean. No crashing waves, no sound whatsoever. I never truly understood the term deafening silence until that moment. For some reason, my body's response was complete and utter fear. I don't know why, but it's the most scared I've been along the entire trip. I was waiting for something horrible to happen. I had no idea what, but my mind was telling me that something bad's about to happen. But less than a minute later, all the noise returned. Definitely the weirdest thing I've ever experienced. One afternoon, I was completing this 14-kilometer, 5-hour hike on the edge of town. It's an unkept track at uneven ground, overgrown, and in many places you rely on coloured markers nailed into trees because the track's covered in grass and it's not the easiest hike. And it's into some pretty unforgiving terrain. We're all wearing hiking shoes, long pants and long sleeve shirts to minimise the risk of snake bites, etc. We're the only people on the track that day that we saw. It's late afternoon and we're about 2 kilometers from the remote trailhead. We're coming up onto this ridge and see someone heading for us. He's wearing weird clothes that are very tattered. He approaches us on the track with wild hair and says hello, but doesn't ask for a reply, simply looking straight ahead, continuing wandering the track. He has no bag or clothing other than some tattered shorts. By the time we get back to the car, it's dark. We hung around for a bit packing up the car and don't see him again. What's more weird is there's no other cars here. The country is very unforgiving. There's no easy way you can loop back to civilization. All he has is one hike stick. I've never seen anything like it to this day, and I can only assume he's a crazy person out there, living off the wilderness. I had a relative that would seek out ghost towns, and I went with him on a few of his excursions. Most of the time, you would find one that is relatively well known. Things were overgrown, etc. But there would always be signs of squatters / campers and hunters or vandalism. One time, he found out about a very small town that was abandoned in the 20s. After a ton of research, he loaded up supplies and planned to hike there to see if he could find it. After several unsuccessful attempted solo hikes, he brought me along. The hike starts out at an old abandoned railroad junction that itself was 5 to 10 miles off the road. We followed a rail line for about 5 minutes. It kept diminishing as we went. Eventually we get to a point where there was no longer any signs of the railroad line and we keep going. He's an experienced hiker and he had a plan where he wanted to go this time. After about 15 or so miles we found it. The town itself was very small. I think there's about 5 houses and a really small general store. One of the houses is in really decent condition. A couple of them have abandoned really quick. Furniture and pictures are left behind. Clothes and other belongings packed but not taken. Almost surreal. We later found out it was dated 1922. The store had some product left on the shelves, but This was not like a store in the traditional sense. It's better described as a trading post. There's a few advertisers' signs and a few boxes of soap flakes and canned items that we can't make out. I guess the story was that the town existed because it was on a rail line. There was a grain storage facility that was originally located a few miles away from the rail line. My uncle speculated that people in town either owned or ran the grain facility. The grain facility burnt down to the ground and was diverted away with the rail line, thus the town died. Or it could have been that the rail line diverted and then the grain facility burned down later. Like I said, I've been to a few ghost towns before. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen there. The people that lived there were relatively well off. It doesn't appear to be a farming community. Everything looks frozen in time. There's no roads nearby. The closest paved road's probably 30 miles away, and it looks like no one's ever seen this before but us. When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around in the woods behind our house on ways home a timber property and found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was that the house had been left so abruptly. There was still an open mail, a magazine sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to the same date in the 1950s. Sheets and blankets still on beds, clothes still in drawers, pantry full of canned and jarred food. Half of it exploded or leaked, dishes in the sink even, unburnt candles sitting out waiting to be used. A fridge outside full of food that had been turned to muck and dust. After years of exploring, we'd never come across anything like this. Even the chicken coop had dozens of skeletons in it. There's even pig skeletons left in the pen. A tractor was parked in the garage and was in great shape for its age. It didn't occur to me as a kid at the time, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was remarkable that the place had been undisturbed. There was no vandalism, signs of entry as far as I could tell. We were the first people to step foot in there for 40 years. Not really camping, but as kids, we lived in a new neighbourhood. It was next to about 40 acres of woods and farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment and random junk. It was great to grow up there, as we spent nearly every day exploring the area. But there was one house off the main road, about 200 yards into the woods. It looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day. She came out screaming at us. She was scary as hell looking, wearing a dirty dress, gross hair, looking like she's never had a shower. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because we knew they'd never let us play back there again. We did go back though sometime, naming her Crazy Mary. We'd spy on her and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even then, never getting closer than 100 feet from her home. About 12 years later, I am home from college and my mum tells me that they took this woman to a mental place. Apparently she lived there the whole time with her dead mum and dad propped up in chairs in the living room. The figures had been dead there for 15 years. dying of natural causes and being propped up by Mary. That means that they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away all them years ago. One of the most surreal things I experienced was while camping. It happened about 2 years ago. I was out collecting firewood. I remembered I forgot something and had to go back to my tent. The second I step out again, it's like the world stopped. There's no sound at all. No birds, no wind through the trees, no bugs or cars in the distance. Nothing. I was the only thing making sound, as though someone pressed mute on a volume dial. Inside my tent's fine, just not outside. After being outside for 10 minutes or so, it's like an explosion of sound happened. Suddenly birds are chirping, the wind is blowing through the trees and I can hear everything again. Truly an unreal experience. My family used to camp in Angolian Park in Ontario when I was a kid. We used to do a lot of the day hikes with our dog. The dog was a crazy runner and run up and down the trail, back and forth between my parents and my brother and me. This one trail ended at a lookout. My brother and I stopped to take in the view, and my dog arrived seconds later running at full speed. He attempted to apply the brakes, but he had so much momentum carrying him that he goes right over the edge. We freak out. Our dogs just went over a cliff, and it's a good 60-foot drop. I venture over to the edge to look, and my dog somehow landed on one ledge that sat about 10 feet down. Now what? At any moment, my dog will fall the rest of the way down. It's a sheer drop with no way back up. Then out of the blue, from the trail behind, a hiker appears with full climbing gear. Now I've never seen anything like it before. The guy goes down, saves my dog, and packs up and leaves. He didn't even stick around to say his name. To all intent and purposes, he returned to the trail and vanished. One of my friends went on a solo fly fishing / camping trip for a weekend. He's in the middle of a creek fly fishing and kept on hearing this weird garbling sound coming up from the creek. So eventually he decided to check it out when he took a break for lunch. It turned out to be a homeless guy that tried to commit suicide by shooting himself. My friend hauled back to call 911 and had to hike back in to show the cops and medics where the guy was, but he was never found. My buddy was so freaked out that he just laid there for hours not knowing what to do. I was camping at Yellowstone / Grand Tents a few years ago. We set up our camper at an actual site and decided to do some 2-day-long backpack trips in some of the longer trails. The second one was the Cascade Canyon. Actually beautiful. So we get about 10 minutes into the 22-mile loop and decide to set up our tent here since it was getting dark. We cook some food and chill for a bit before heading back to bed. It gets to around 2 AM and we're suddenly all awoken by some sound outside. My mind immediately goes to bears. Then it starts talking. I'll never forget it. I think there's 3 or 4 in a tent. Let's just go out, someone said. None of us can sleep the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn, we hightail it out of there. Hike 12-ish miles into about 3 hours and get to a ranger station, reports what happened. They said they had received a similar call the night before. They sent a ranger down there. I never found out what was going on. Didn't hear anyone getting hurt. But then again, I didn't want to look into it. In my college days, now 20 years ago, me and my friends often took off to the North Georgia mountains on the weekend. We wanted to smoke, drink and commute with nature. These mountains were perfect. One weekend, however, this unsettling event occurred to me. My friend Bill and his German Shepherd Monty headed out towards Sky Valley. It was the beginning of the fall semester at UGA, and not much was going on yet. We had found an area where a dirt road led back half a mile, and then we would hike in another mile or so and set up near a creek. Excellent trails were nearby with fun places to explore, not to mention flat ground perfect for setting up camp. Bill and I arrived at our spot at around 4 PM and we got a fire going. We were musicians, Bill playing a guitar and me being a percussionist, so we started jamming. After 10 minutes, we chatted about life and girls before tucking in for the night. It was a clear night, so we just slept under the stars. It is important to take note that we have not seen any sign of any other people in the area during any of our other trips. At about 2 in the morning though, I'm awoken by Monty growling, a deep growl that I've never heard before. Bill was still dead to the world, that'd be me. And I sat up and looked around and listened, thinking maybe an animal had come to our campsite. The fire was only embers at this point. I hear barely audible voices in the distance. Focusing on the area of the voices, I see a faint red glow, followed by another faint glow to the left of the first. This is about 100 yards away, my mind connecting what I'm seeing. Cigarette embers burning that are approaching us. "Bill, wake up," I whisper. Bill rose from his sleep and has no idea what's happening, and I explain to him. At this point, Monty started barking as the strangers approach our camp. Now around this time, the others stood up, who were completely unfazed by our now rabid 80-pound German Shepherd, and we see 2 incredibly unkept late 30s or 40s looking weird guys. Bill told Monty to calm down. I'll never forget the look of these guys, skinny as hell, about 5'8", looking like something out of a swamp horror film, and probably 5 teeth between them, each having huge knives attached to their belts. "What you boys doing out here? Looks like you're having fun," they said. We responded and told them that we had been out there to camp and drink some beer, then asking for one, to which we gave them. They said did we want to hang out with them, and we declined, saying we have to be out early. Now throughout the conversation, anything Bill or I said, they looked at each other before responding. Finally, before leaving, one of them said, "You'll stay safe. You never know who you could run into out here," and winked as they walk away laughing. We pack up a few hours later and leave and never went back there again. The fact that we were only awoken because of the dog still terrifies me. As I've mentioned in my previous post before, my family has had some remote land up in the mountains outside of Eureka. I come down here a few times every year and haven't really experienced anything too out of the ordinary. But last night was different. Different to say the least. I didn't know this before, but apparently this area is pretty popular for UFO sightings. I still don't know if that's what this was, but I'm having a very hard time to come up with a logical explanation. We had a good fire going for a few hours, and after everyone else went to bed, it was just my dad, my fiance and I left. So we're all gathered round there, just talking, even about constellations. So we all leaned back and were staring up at the sky. My fiance then pointed out a light that was noticeably brighter than the stars. It was steadily moving. Immediately I figured it as a satellite, but my dad chimed up with, "I don't think it is. Watch it for a second." My dad and I are hugely into aliens, and both have had a fair amount of sightings in the past. I focused closer on the light and saw it wasn't just gliding across in a straight line, it was zigzagging, back and forth, moving eastwards. Three of us are explaining about how weird it was when suddenly it screeched towards the southern mountains. I'm thinking to myself, okay, is this actually happening? The light just stopped suddenly, hovering above the mountain for at least 5 minutes. At this point, we're all saying it's definitely not a satellite, with the occasional comment like, "Wow, this is wild." The light started to shift again to the right until it was behind a tree, and we lose sight of it completely. We went back to the normal campfire for a couple of minutes, and my fiance gets some drinks. As soon as he got up, the entire sky lit up in an almost painfully bright white flash, like lighting on steroids. This was a crystal clear night. There wasn't a storm on the radar for miles and miles. We couldn't even see one little wispy cloud. It could not have been lighting. My dad and I are the only ones who saw it, as most people were asleep and my fiance's inside. There wasn't a single sound when it happened, no boom or rumble, but the entire mountain went dead silent for a few minutes after. I mean, honestly, it's just so eerie. It's like time around us paused momentarily, and my dad ended up feeling so uncomfortable and anxious that he just went to bed. The two of us stayed up for a while after, but we didn't see anything weird or any flashes, but we had a very heavy sense of unease afterwards. Back in October of 1989, my mum and I went up to the western part of Northern Carolina for a week to see the leaves change colour. We rented a cabin which was owned by the cousin of my brother's former high school band teacher who had retired several years earlier. The band director was more or less keeping watch over the place. Now, he actually lived down the street, but it wasn't until Friday afternoon that we saw him. The cabin was somewhat in the wilderness, but it was near a main road. The band director had to go away for the weekend and was letting us know. We had the name of the cousin in case we needed any help. This was on a Friday afternoon. Up until that time, the trip has been uneventful. Friday evening we went to a church dinner, which was down the road. When we came back home, it's already dark. My mum started thinking about, we're the only ones on this road, and we don't know where the nearest neighbour was, which is a little unsettling. The moon wasn't full, but there was light to the moon. We had separate rooms in the cabin. The power went out in the cabin shortly after we come back from the church dinner. Then my mother heard what sounded like footsteps, and she saw what looked like an outline of a hat. There was a man walking around near the cabin. Then we saw this hat disappear to the woods. By this time, both of us are terrified that this man is going to come into the cabin to hurt us. Both of us wondering if he had cut the power source. I decided to sleep in bed, which is near my mum's room. We tried to sleep, but then were awoken by an owl howling. My mum could see the owl's eyes, which were looking into the window. The drake couldn't be closed entirely. The owl didn't take its eyes off my mum the entire night. The owl also hooted all night. My mum tried to ignore the owl, but its presence really unnerved her, and this unnerved me. Neither of us could sleep at every noise it jarred us. It would be like, "What's that? What noise is that?" And every once in a while we would see the outline of the hat walking around the general area. Then it'd go off into the woods. Both of us are freaked out at this point, but we weren't about to leave in the middle of night. There was no phone in the cabin, and this is long before cell phones were in common usage. The power did finally come back on several hours later, or seemed to. Now originally we were gonna leave on the Sunday, but as soon as the sun came up on Saturday, we left. A couple of days later my mum got a call from the band director. Apparently the man we saw was a mountain man who was very weird and done weird things around other cabins and is known in the area. This happened to my FIL probably 10 years ago in a hunting cabin in Alabama. It popped into my head as we're heading out there tomorrow for a few days of deer hunting. He told me to go ahead and share the story. It's short, but as I get a little creeped out in the woods, this would have freaked me out. So, as many people probably know, we get out an hour or so before light and climb into a tree, into a stand, usually fairly deep into the hunt. Now on this morning, my FIL has been in his stand for a couple hours, and it was getting light and he was reading a book as he wanted to wait for something to happen. Out of the fog, he heard a woman's voice much closer than anyone should have been to him at that time. She's calling Hunter, "Oh Hunter," in a very singy voice, like a mother calling to her child. Now as I said, we're pretty deep in the woods. There are sticks and dried leaves everywhere. You generally make a pretty good racket getting to your stand, which is why we get out so early. Not only that, but in order to know where he was and spot him in the camouflage tree, she must have seen his light when he walked out and followed him into the woods and waited hours before calling him. His first thought was that the woman was calling someone named Hunter, maybe her son. She called again and realizes that he is a hunter. She turns around, peers around the trees and sees a young woman. She, in very few words and in halting speech, explains that something's wrong with her hot water heater and wants to know if he can come and look. Now the strangeness of the situation hasn't set in yet, and he's a give the shirt off his back kind of guy. Not to mention he's nearly 6'2", 300 pounds with a gun. So he wasn't too worried about this small woman and starts getting down to have a look. He follows her back to her mobile home, which borders our hunting land, probably about 10 minutes away. She walks inside, leaving the door open. He is trailing behind a little, so as he gets to the door, kind of knocks and sticks his head in to say hello. There's no answer. When he entered the laundry room, he can see there is a hot water heater and it's just pouring out of the bottom. Just absolutely pouring, I mean. He walks over and turns the valve off and says hello again, but hears nothing. The house is empty. Empty of people anyway. A disaster is inside though. At this point, he's starting to see how strange it is, and decides that this is just a kind of situation where you get robbed then murdered, and nopes out of there. Now, we have hunted this land for years since and have never seen anyone at this place. Every time I pass her place, it sends chills up my spine. I don't know if she was a ghost or something, but this was definitely some kind of setup, and I'm glad that we all got out of there okay. Had we been weaker, smaller targets, I'm sure the whole situation would have gone a lot differently. I went hiking with my boyfriend and a few of his friends. The 5 of us were heading up a not so popular mountain trail that's about 10 minutes long up to a small lake. We saw 2 couples on their way down, but no one had passed us on our way up. Now the trail isn't super easy, and wildlife is pretty common. We see a moose about 3 miles in, so we're all on guard for more moose or a mountain lion or anything that can cause a problem. After the moose, we ran into a small patch of snow that's maybe 100 feet along the trail. Past the snow, we walk about another 20 to 30 yards and find a deer's rib cage and spine. We gathered around it not saying much, and one of the guys turns it over with a stick. It was picked totally clean. After we stand up, an older guy is standing like 10 feet away from us just staring. Not one of us heard or saw him walk up. It was like he just appeared. After we make eye contact, he just turns around, jumps over the little creek, cutting through 18 inches of snow, then walking up the side of the mountain to disappear.